and then I'm going to introduce our speaker for this evening, who we're very excited to hear from, Evans Paull, or Ev Paull, who, as many of us may already know, has just put out a really wonderful title, Stop the Road, Story from the Trenches of Baltimore's Road Wars, which we're going to learn more about this evening. But a little background as well. Evans Paull is spent 45 years as a city planner working in Baltimore and nationally on urban redevelopment issues. Began his career in Baltimore City Department of Planning as a general planner. And after starting the Baltimore Brownfields Initiative, he tackled some of those same issues at the national level, working first for Northeast Midwest Institute before becoming director of the National Brownfields Coalition. Although now retired, many of his published articles and papers still appear on the Redevelopment Economics website. And Paull has won several awards, including Brownfield's Leadership, the Phoenix Award, Governor Smart Growth Award, and Professional Achievement and Economic Development from the Maryland Chapter American Planning Association. So very well accomplished, very well prepared to talk about the topic at hand this evening. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker. And if you'll pardon us for just a second, I'm going to go ahead and do the screen sharing. So Ev, as we are moving through, please just give me a nudge if I am not clicking through the slides quickly enough, and I'll try to follow your lead on that. But just a second while I get that screen share up. All right. And can you see,
Yep.
Ev, what we have? All righty. Well, I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and take off my video.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to do this, David. Special thanks to Mike French for helping organize this. I'm seeing a couple of very familiar faces in the audience. Almost feel like I'm on my home court here. Howell Baum, Janet Felston, and Jim Kraft are all folks that I know and have had involvement in these kinds of issues over quite a few years. This book, I think this is sort of the quintessential untold story. And really, there's sort of three untold stories here, any one of which I thought might have made a good book. But I felt actually kind of fortunate to be able to be the guy to dig into these issues and bring them to an audience that I think would like to hear it and needs to hear it. But the three issues are one is the sort of populist narrative, the incredible win of the outsiders and the activists and all the folks who didn't have a resume over the economic and political establishment. When you think about the fact that these highway plans were backed by the governor, the mayor, 17 of the 18 council members, the Greater Baltimore Committee, the Chamber of Commerce, all the power hitters were on one side, and all of the no names were on the other side, and the no names mostly won. Two highways stopped and one relocated. The second major theme is just the significance of what happened, and that Baltimore, if those highways had been built, much of the later redevelopment of the historic communities of Fells Point and Canton and Federal Hill the new community of Inner Harbor East, that much of that would not have happened had those highways been built. So it just has a lot of significance for the city. And I'm sorry, am I being loud enough, and anything we need to adjust? Then the third issue was that the Road Wars provides a very important and revealing window into the city's unfair treatment of its African American population. So it was those three issues that kind of drew me in. But a funny thing happened on the way to writing this book. I've been writing like a city planner for 45 years. And if you've ever read a city planning document, you know it's pretty dry stuff. We are very succinct. If we are not boring, we have actually failed in our mission. My characterization of how city planners write it goes like this. If a city planner tried to write a love story, he would say, Jean loved Clara because bullet point 1, bullet point 2. So that I had to kind of overcome my tendency to write like that. But I was aided enormously by the interviews that I conducted. And the interviews I conducted kind of usually went something like this, where I was boring in on some detail that had been missing from my research. And mostly my interviewees did not remember those details, but what they did remember was these great anecdotes and stories and the personal interest part of the Road Wars. And midway through writing this, I kind of had an aha moment that I've got something way better than a city planning story. I've got an amazing human interest story. And that's the point at which I tried to make a transition to writing like a storyteller instead of a city planner. And, my readers will be the judge as to how well I did. But I can tell you one thing, I had a whole lot more fun writing it as a storyteller than as a city planner. Next slide. Okay, let's start in 1957 with the 1957 highway plan. Two highways coming in from the west and two highways again exiting to the east, downtown, circumnavigated by expressways. This is the first plan that puts the highway through Leakin Park out on the west side. The picture here is the 900 block of Tyson Street, which amazingly was the biggest holdup and the reason that the 1957 highway plan did not get implemented. So there were issues as to how the highway would traverse Mount Vernon, but those were not the most important issues. The issue that really rang true with folks and stopped the highway in its tracks was this little section of Tyson Street, all of like 300 feet long. Tyson Street had a reputation. It was symbolic. It was kind of, history versus modernism. It was private renewal as opposed to any big dollar urban renewal, and it was rehabilitation versus clearance. And it had been written up as a model for urban renewal in that context, kind of an alternative to what was happening in the big urban renewal projects. It was even written up in the Encyclopedia Britannica, several national magazines, and Baltimore did not want that highway to go through Tyson Street. So the legislature actually passed an ordinance that said, yeah, go ahead and build your highway, but don't build it through Tyson Street. And the engineers goofed. They sort of drew a line in the sand and said, we got to go through Tyson Street. And eventually they lost the city council and the will to prosecute the highway. So they went back to the drawing boards, all because of Tyson Street. Next slide. Which leads us there. I've skipped over a step or two here, but leads us to the 1961 10D plan drafted by the consulting engineers J.E. Greiner. This is the plan that I have dubbed the Future Investment Prevention Program, because what it does is it enters through South Baltimore at Montgomery Street, crosses through Federal Hill, takes out a chunk of Federal Hill Park, crosses the Inner Harbor on a 14-lane bridge, occupies Inner Harbor East with an enormous 5-level interchange, then slices right through the middle of Fells Point between Lancaster and Thames Street, and then it hugs the waterfront, hugs the Canton waterfront out to the Canton industrial area. So that highway, had it been built, is the one that, that's the significance that I was talking about earlier. Had that highway been built, the later redevelopment of all of those would have been jeopardized. J.E. Greiner manages to gain the blackest hat among all the consultants in the road wars, partly because they were the ones who drafted this disastrous plan. But more than that, you have to remember that back in 1961, not very many people foresaw the kind of waterfront renewal with the waterfront used as an amenity rather than as a port-related function. Not many people foresaw that. So I can't ding Greiner too much for that. Many cities made that mistake of guiding highways along waterfronts. But Greiner kept working to promote this particular plan even after the city adopted the substitute, which was the Fort McHenry Tunnel that eventually got built. They worked at cross purposes with the other members of their consulting team, had their fellow consultants bugged. But the clincher for their black hat status is that when the Lincoln Park segment went into the courtroom, they had the attorney for the Lincoln Park advocates thrown off the case with a very underhanded move. So we award Greiner the blackest hat of the consultants. And one thing to note on this, aside from South Baltimore, Federal Hill, and Fells Point and Canton, if you look up next to Lincoln Park, you'll see a diagonal swath going through Rosemont, just completely bisecting a very good middle-class African-American community. And we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. So nobody knows it in 1961, but we're in a race to 1966. If these highways go under construction before 1966, everything that happened later would become moot, because it was in 1966 that Congress enacted protections for parks and historic areas. And that's when the anti-highway movement really took off. Next slide. So The bridge to get to 1966, I think this is kind of interesting. Uh, there were three sources of delay. One was opposition in Southwest Baltimore, not opposition in Fells Point, Federal Hill, Sharpleadden Hall, or all of the other communities that we now associate with the road wars. It was Southwest Baltimore that put up the biggest resistance, because the I-95, well, this East-West Expressway, later I-95, was going to go partly through Carroll Park and take some residences in that area. So that was actually the biggest source of community opposition. But the highway planners actually shot themselves in the foot too. John Funk, the State Roads Commissioner, came to a decision point in 1963, but he refused to make a decision because the state had authorized Wilbur Smith Associates to do a traffic study, a regional traffic study, and he wanted the results of that regional traffic study before he made a decision. It took 18 months before the Wilbur Smith Associates plan came out, and the Wilbur Smith plan was pretty much dead on arrival for anyone who did not want to turn Baltimore into a Los Angeles style mass of spaghetti of freeways and interchanges. 48 miles of expressways, 10D by comparison was 21, 27 interchanges in the city. Altogether new alignments. You'll note here, for example, there's one on Cold Spring Lane. If we have time at the end, I'll get Councilman Kraft to talk about that one. We had a conversation about that one. That's kind of interesting. The only alignment that they missed was the Fort McHenry alignment that later got built. So you can really just say that John Funk shot himself in the foot with this 18-month delay for an altogether worthless plan. And Baltimore rejoices that he did. Next slide. These are the guys who had the greatest influence on the battle over Federal Hill and the Inner Harbor. David, could we go one slide forward and then come back again? Okay, this was the plan for I-95 going through the Inner Harbor, pretty much slicing right through Federal Hill, taking a chunk out of the park, crossing on the bridge, and then occupying Harbor East. Okay, so now, David, please go back. That plan would have been implemented, and I should have said back in the beginning, one of the things that kind of interests me about all of this is the what ifs. And the what ifs meaning, if this hadn't happened, the many of these communities that got saved would not have gotten saved. So the what if for Federal Hill starts with Lou Fisher, who was the leader of the Fells Point opposition. Back in 1966, just as she and Tom Ward were kind of getting started with the Preservation Society, it was actually before the Preservation Society. She was looking for allies, and she had a meeting with a guy named George Kostrowski of RTKL. Kostrowski brought in Archibald Rogers, who was one of the partners at RTKL, and Archibald Rogers was a guy whose opinion mattered. He had been a former president of the Greater Baltimore Committee. Lou Fisher must have been pretty persuasive, because Archibald Rogers kind of took this issue on, and he sold the State Roads Commission and the city on the idea of a completely new way to plan these highways in the city. he conceptualized what was called the urban design concept teams. And he sold that to the State Roads Commission. And then they all went to the Federal Department of Highways and convinced the highway administrator to fund on a trial basis several cities who would try out urban design concept teams. Urban design concept teams were multidisciplinary entities involving not just engineers, but also city planners, economists, sociologists, and so on. So it was designed to replace the one-sided rule of engineers with a multidisciplinary team that would be much more comprehensive and much more thoughtful about highway planning than you would tend to get with just the engineers. This led to the Battle of Federal Hill, if you will, second Battle of Federal Hill, if you remember the first one back in the War of in the Civil War, was won without much of a fight. This one was a big fight. We call this the conquistadors of concrete versus the platitudinous planners. The engineers are the conquistadors, the planners being Nathaniel Owings of Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. He was the guy that was hired by our Archibald Rogers and the State Roads Commission to head up the urban design concept team. And Nathaniel Owings must have been a piece of work. He was a guy who was very headstrong and was able to take on the overwhelming consensus that the city should build that 10D plan. Next slide again. Here's kind of the timeline for Federal Hill and the Inner Harbor, the 1961 J.E. Greiner plan. And then in 1968, the urban design concept team, who I call the insurgent planners, because they basically thumbed their nose at the usual conventions of reporting through lines of established communication. There were urban design concept team planners who were working with the opposition. They helped form the Movement Against Destruction, the citywide opposition group. They were writing position papers for the opposition. It's pretty astonishing that they were doing so much to undermine the highway plan on the dime of the highway planners. But it was Nathaniel Owings who was most responsible for thwarting the Federal Hill plan. He was the one who conceptualized the Fort McHenry. First, it was a bridge, and then later it was a tunnel, the Fort McHenry option. And he went over the heads of his client group to the Federal Highway Administrator and convinced the Highway Administrator that this was a solution. Then he went over the heads of his client group again at this 500-person meeting at the Citizens Planning and Housing Association. At the time, his entire oversight team still wanted some version of this highway through Federal Hill. And he used that meeting at Citizens Planning and Housing Association to make the case for Fort McHenry. And believe me, his oversight group was livid. They tried to fire him. They tried to stop payments, but the communities came to the defense of he and his team, and they were unable to fire him, basically. So in 1970, a very important thing happened. The Preservation Society added Federal Hill to the National Register of Historic Places. And then in 1973, Federal Hill was added to the Fells Point lawsuit, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. It was in 1968, though, back with the urban design concept team, that Mayor D'Alessandro adopted the Fort McHenry option. It wobbled back and forth for 7 years until it was finally concluded in 1975 that the Fort McHenry alignment would get all of the approvals needed, and finally the Federal Hill Harbor Crossing was put to rest. Next slide. So Nathaniel Owings and the urban design concept team had 3 enormous gains. You remember the slice through, that diagonal slice through Rosemont. Urban design concept team designed an alternative to that avoided Rosemont. That was a big win at the time. Later, that whole segment was dropped, but for 7, 8 years, it was still alive, but Rosemont had been bypassed. The ring around the west side of downtown was shifted to a boulevard. I think that was a huge gain, and the Federal Hill Crossing eliminated in favor of Fort McHenry. Okay, next slide. Okay, the highway to nowhere. In West Baltimore, there was no park or historic area that might have been the leverage to oppose the highway, and the activists chose to concentrate on what was called replacement value rather than fair market value for acquiring the homes that were needed for the highway. And they had an enormously significant win, an amazing win when the city, the state, and the federal government decided to offer up to $5,000, and that's around $40,000 today, in payments over and above fair market value. The what if here is that in, I think it was 1996, this area of West Baltimore was placed on the National Register. And the what if is, had folks realized that it might get on the National Register way back in the mid-1960s, perhaps Harlem Park would have been saved, and we would not be living with the highway to nowhere. And next slide. So this is the timeline for the highway to nowhere. It started with the 1944 plan drafted by the New York Highway and Public Works mogul Robert Moses. Moses famously said that, quote unquote, the more of these areas that are wiped out, the better off the city will be. He clearly painted himself into the corner of a guy who believed in, quote unquote, Negro removal. At the time, 1944, that is not surprising, but it is somewhat surprising that later progressives on race like McKeldin and D'Alessandro and Schaefer failed to reevaluate. So in 1972, there was an injunction against the highway through Leakin Park, but 1 year later, in 1973, with Schaefer now at the helm, and Schaefer trying to demonstrate his resolve to build these highways wherever he could, wherever he was not stopped by legal action, Schaefer went ahead and put it under construction, even though he fully knew that it might never meet up with the rest of I-70. Finally, in 1981, the city gave up and traded in the funds for I-70. Next slide. We're going to pass over that one. Next slide. Okay, moving to Fells Point. I've titled this slide the movers and shakers, and that's sort of a tongue-in-cheek title because if the truth be known, Fells Point didn't have any movers and shakers. What they did have was the four pillars of the Preservation Society. You start with Lou Fisher and Tom Ward in the upper right-hand corner there. They were the original organizers, and Bob Eney and Tom Ward and Jack Gleason were the other two guys that were the mainstays. They were the guys who did the survey, this exhaustive survey to demonstrate that Fells Point should be on the National Register of Historic Places. The what ifs here are kind of interesting. Lou Fisher was a resident of Ruxton. They called her the Ruxton Radical. And she purchased a house in Fells Point with what I call 100% love and 0% due diligence, meaning she bought a house that was in a row of vacant houses, and it never occurred to her that there might be a condemnation ordinance that was responsible for the vacancy. So her involvement was sort of, she fell into this because of an ill-advised purchase of a house on the waterfront in Fells Point. Bob Eney and Jack Gleason amazingly came to Baltimore from New York City only 1 week before the first meeting of the Preservation Society. Friends brought them into that meeting, and they became two of the leaders of the group. And Bob Eney is a particularly interesting guy. He was dyslexic to the point that he could barely write a sentence, but he was kind of a savant in relation to architecture, historical architecture. They said he had 5,000 architecture books, and he had committed them all to memory. So when he set out to do all the documentation for putting Fells Point on the National Register for Historic Places, he brought all that knowledge with him. And for him, for anybody else that might have been drudgery. For Eney, it was this tapestry that he was unfolding. He was just an amazing guy. And if there was one person who seemed to be put on this earth for the sole purpose of saving a historic community from an expressway, I would nominate Bob Eney. Next slide. So this is the timeline for Fells Point, and the alignment you can see right there between Thames Street and Lancaster Street, right through the heart of Fells Point, with interchanges on either side. So the 1961 Griner Plan, then 1967 is when the Preservation Society was formed. Those first meetings involving Lou and Tom and Bob Eney and Jack Gleason. Then in 1968, the Urban Design Concept Team, which had performed stellar work for Federal Hill, completely failed on Fells Point, and Fells Point was still saddled with an elevated highway going between Lancaster and Thames Street. In 1969, the Preservation Society succeeded in getting Fells Point put on the National Register. There's a great story that goes with that, and I'm looking at the clock here, and I'm running out of time a little bit. But Bob Eney tells this amazing story about how They had a meeting and into deciding how they were going to channel their information to the federal government. And in that meeting was a person who had some IOUs with the vice president, Agnew. So they decided to channel the information through her to Agnew. Agnew had been a highway supporter, of course, but he sees this package come in from someone that he has big time IOUs for, and he just directs his staff to send it right over to the National Park Service. And in 3 days, it was approved without any chance for meddling on the part of the city of Baltimore. Eney says that the nature of that relationship between that woman and Vice President Agnew was that she bagged for him, that she was part of the nefarious system of bribery and so on that brought Agnew down a couple of years later. So proceeding on, I'm going to jump over some of this. The court stopped acquisitions with a decision in 1972, and that led the city to look at tunnel alignments, some going under Fells Point and some going around Fells Point to the south. In 1977, the President's Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, one of those groups that was created in 1966 congressional legislation, found that all of those highway options that went under Fells Point would have unmitigable and adverse impact. Therefore, the only permissible option was the tunnel around Fells Point. That eventually proved to be beyond the city's ability to pay for the local match. And so the segment was finally dropped 1980 to 1983. Next slide. Next slide. This is the urban design concept team plan for what would go on around and under the highway. The first thing that you'll notice here is the incredible disappearing highway, the only evidence of which is the columns that support the highway. And underneath the highway, we find tourist shopping, drugstore, supermarket. They actually had the gall to call this the town center for Fells Point. I have a couple of quotes in here, but I need to speed up. So go to the next slide, please. Fells Point was under two threats, really. One was the highway, but because of the community's success in installing the highway, the downside was that all those buildings that had been acquired were just going downhill steadily. That led to squatters taking over a lot of those buildings. And there's a wonderful story about Schaefer's discovery of the squatters movement. The squatters came in and they actually reached an agreement with Bob Embry, the housing commissioner, and Embry turned it into a formal rental program. He realized that those houses, that occupying those houses was a whole lot better than just letting them decline as vacants. But he didn't tell Schaefer about it. He did it on the sly. And one day Schaefer was down there and he runs into someone who was coming out of one of the city-owned houses. Then they're obviously doing some kind of construction. And he says, "Young man, you're going to lose all your investment in this house when the highway comes through." And the guy says, "Well, Bob Embry told me the highway's never going to happen." So you can imagine Embry got in a little bit of hot water over that, but and Schaefer tried to shut down the squatters movement, but he couldn't do it. It just would have looked bad politically. So so the squatters movement continued, and Fells Point was kind of kept alive by the squatters. Next slide. Okay, I think I'm going to make this my last slide since I'm going kind of slow here. Sharp Leadenhall. If you don't know where Sharp Leadenhall is, take a look at the area map. It's wedged between Federal Hill and the football stadium, small African-American community, which is now gentrifying. One of the things I tried to do with the Road Wars book was give historic context to all these communities. And Sharp Leadenhall has this amazing history as a center for African-American freedmen prior to the Civil War. The reason that it was Baltimore's center for African-American freedmen had a lot to do with the Quakers that had settled in this corridor prior to the African Americans. The Quakers, of course, were vehemently anti-slavery, but not just that. They helped establish the first African American school, the first African American church, the first abolitionist society in Baltimore. But it also, a lot of it relates to Elisha Tyson, the guy who Tyson Street is named for. Elisha Tyson was wealthy, and he was not only an abolitionist, he was on the Underground Railroad, and he used his wealth to pay for the legal costs of many, they think more than 1,000 folks who were seeking freedman status. But it was actually more than that. He actually had his own vigilante group. There were Southerners that were coming up to Baltimore and taking former slaves back to the South, re-enslaving people. And Elisha Tyson employed these guys to go after the Southerners that were kidnapping our African-American population. So when Elisha Tyson died in, I believe it was like 1840, 10,000 African-Americans attended his funeral. That was 2/3 of the entire African-American population of Baltimore. Sharp Leadenhall is not a happy story in relation to the road wars. There were 2 highway plans and 1 urban renewal plan that almost wiped out Sharp Leadenhall, but for the efforts of Mildred Moon, pictured there on the right. And I'm getting very short on time, so I think I'm going to hold up there and open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Paull. This was excellent. And as you said, we can go ahead and open up to questions. So if anybody would like to either put their questions in the chat, or you are welcome to unmute yourself and verbalize your question. I've got some as well, if our guests are shy.
Could you clear the screen of the slides so we can see each other?
Mike, were you gonna ask a question?
Well, yeah, but I thought I'd wait a bit and let people get some more historical. Mine's a little more kind of not theoretical in a sense, but I was just going to say I've got the book, and this is the second time I've heard this presentation, and each time I'm just more and more impressed by this great work of, it's, relatively modern history that in the lifetime of some of us, and it's just what we need for this time. Yeah, but I see Stephen has his hand up.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Hey, thank you so much, Mr. Paull, for an excellent presentation and an excellent piece of work. I want to start where you ended, the Sharp-Leadenhall community. So you mentioned that it has been further compartmentalized by the highway plan. I'm thinking probably exit 52 that runs right over top of it. How much of Sharp-Leadenhall was left? I mean, when they further impacted it, I would imagine that the Sharpshoe Church had moved almost what 100 what I don't know how long it's been up on Dolphin Street, but it obviously been moved to create space for Camden Yards and the like. So how much of Sharp-Leadenhall was still left to be impacted?
So Sharp-Leadenhall was a community of 3,000 folks before the highway plans. And by the time, as I said, there were two highway plans in different points of time, both of whom involved acquiring a lot of properties. And then there was the Otterbein Urban Renewal Plan that took another couple of blocks at the north end of Sharp-Leadenhall. And between all those plans, there were only 500 folks left in the mid-1970s.
Wow.
And due to the indefatigable Mildred Moon, she was just one of these amazing people who were very determined, but also very personable and just able to command attention. She's representing a very small African-American community in an overwhelmingly white district, and yet she was able to hold sway to some degree. So there were several affordable housing developments that were built, partly a lot due to the pressure applied by Mildred Moon, and now Sharp-Leadenhall has a population of about 1,000. But it's subject to gentrification pressures, and it's not the same as back before the highways.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We have Judith Flom with a question.
Yeah, you didn't mention in the whole story about Federal Hill and Fells Point, Barbara Mikulski. I understand she was heavily involved in it, and some they say she got her political start there. Is
Yeah.
she in your book?
Oh yes, yeah. I give Barbara her due, and she was very important. She was the spokesperson for the anti-highway movement, and she helped move the dial on public opinion. And public opinion was really important here. It prevented the highway planners from taking any shortcuts. If anything, they ended up on a lot of long cuts because of public opinion. I kind of felt like that Barbara has gotten her due in relation to the road wars, and I wanted to elevate people's understanding of all the other folks that contributed to stopping the highways or to rebuilding communities. So my focus is a little bit more on building men up. I certainly didn't intend to tear Barbara down. She was very important to the issue.
Thank you.
So another one of our participants had a question about the documents and some of the imagery that you used both in the presentation and the book. Wondering, was there anywhere to see existing documents in a larger format? And I guess I had a follow-up question, just if you could talk a little bit about where you did locate some of those original documents and maybe speak to that accessibility piece for fellow researchers here.
Yeah. I, I have planned to put a lot of what I found on the University of Baltimore in the University of Baltimore library. And I just haven't done it yet, and hope most of my files are digital, so it should be fairly easy. If there are folks who have specific research needs, just contact me, and I'm happy to hunt through my files and see if I've got anything. But my sources, University of Baltimore has really good files on the Movement Against Destruction and Southeast Council Against the Road. The Preservation Society gave me access to their files. Tom Ward's family gave me access to his personal files. I didn't talk a whole lot about Tom, but he was the only highway opponent back in the mid-1960s in city council. I used the city archives, of course, newspapers. The Pratt Library has great online newspaper archives.
I got to say, as a 19th century historian, I'm very jealous of your ability to do oral history with actual participants.
Right. Yeah, that was the magic of the book, and for me it made it really fun because I had known some of these guys when I started work in the city planning department back in the 1970s, and I'd fallen away from most of them. I sort of reconnected with them, and getting their stories, all those anecdotes and everything, that's the human interest side of the book, and I think it gives it a strength that it would not have had if I had just kind of written this like a city planning document.
If there's no one else, I'd like to ask my zinger question, Evan. It's not entirely a historical question about looking at the past, but do you have anything you've picked up in this research that what could we tell today's planners to inform their thinking so that, their various fads, and not, well, fads is the wrong word, but, every so often there's conventional wisdom about how to do something. Right. And nobody could, we look at this in the background of the success of the renovation of Federal Hill and Fells Point and Canton, and they didn't have that to look at. What can we do to, sort of, I don't know, enhance? I think back in my own community of Waverly in the 70s or 80s when we had our urban renewal ordinance. The thing then was to signs perpendicular to stores were bad, overhanging the sidewalk. And so just flat fronts. And I think we've lost a lot to that, even though they were sometimes an eyesore. So what would you tell today's planners to say, hey, don't look like a jerk in 40 years?
Yeah, I'd probably tell them there's no way to avoid looking like a jerk in 40 years. But when I went to school back in the early 1970s, it was kind of a tumultuous time, but planners still believed in these large-scale urban renewal projects that were very often targeted to lower-income African-American neighborhoods, which checked all the boxes to qualify, quote unquote, as slums, but what we were not understanding was that many of those communities were pretty solid in terms of how they were functioning economically and socially, and kids were being brought up in a productive fashion, and ripping them apart from their neighborhoods was mostly detrimental. Today, it's hard to tell going forward what parallels there might be, what conventional wisdoms we're buying into today that we should not be buying into. But things are changing awfully fast, and the way downtowns have always functioned as the place for face-to-face contact between the banks and the governmental decision makers and the real estate moguls and the this, that, and the other. The connection between place and work has completely changed here in the last few years, and is probably going to be in for more changes. I suspect that new transportation models will come in that we're not really thinking about now, new modes of transportation that might make highways and maybe even mass transit outmoded. One of the guys I interviewed had an interesting thought. He said, what if downtown sort of migrates to Port Covington in 30 years from now? People look at I-95 and say, wow, what were they thinking building I-95 down through this gorgeous part of South Baltimore? So who knows? Maybe even I-95 will look like a mistake. I characterize it as the highway that had to be built, though.
So I've got we'll try to real quickly, if it's all right with you, take 3 quick questions. So I have 2 hands raised, and then the first question here from Pat is, what is the current status of the highway to nowhere? And then we'll hear from Jan and Dean.
Okay, so I only know, I'm just sort of a layman on the highway to nowhere. Remember, I spent the last 5 years studying what happened 50 years ago. I know the city won a $2 million grant from the federal government in what's called the Reconnecting Communities program. $2 million is going to mostly go for studies and planning, not for any real remedies. That would be a second phase, and it will be a very expensive phase. The problem with the highway to nowhere is that the adjoining neighborhoods have gone downhill so far that doing something just in the highway strip I don't know if it can really work when the adjoining neighborhoods have gone downhill so far. So I think it requires a comprehensive effort, not just for the corridor, but for the adjoining neighborhoods.
And so we have, is there a present day equivalent of tendencies of this history of stop the road, such as gentrification, juxtapose the abundance of abandoned, deteriorating houses and structures?
Wait, repeat that?
And Jan, if you'd like to unmute, maybe you can restate or clarify your question.
Hi, I'm sorry. Yeah, on one hand, you see neighborhoods getting gentrified, such as Sharp Leadenhall or Woodbury, but then you see juxtaposed a lot of abandoned houses. And some of them are quite beautiful, but beyond anyone's means to really bring them up to code, up to date. But the gentrification goes on. And a lot of the things that are being built in gentrified areas, new, are really pretty slapdash poor quality.
I'm not really hearing a question there.
Do you see that as like what happened with the road, Stop the Road? Do you see anything growing in opposition to gentrification?
Well,
Like what's going to happen, for instance, to the neighborhoods around the highway to nowhere?
I'd be surprised if the highway to nowhere is quote unquote gentrified.
Do you have a different explanation of what gentrification is?
Well, as a guy who has been working as a city planner for a downtrodden city that needs investment and needs homeowners that can pay the tax bills and support the services, I'm not altogether opposed to gentrification. I think the city needs gentrification. I think it needs to be sensitively handled, and to the extent that race issues are involved in gentrification, there's obviously extra sensitivity there. But for example, in Federal Hill and Fells Point, there were battles over gentrification after the highway plans were lifted. Canton too, and I really can't. In the longer scheme of things, a city like Baltimore needs young people, coming back into neighborhoods, investing in older houses, bringing them up to a better standard. You want to make sure that doesn't happen in a completely unfair way to the former residents. But trying to stop gentrification, I'm not going to be in that camp.
Thank you.
All right, Dean, you want to round us out here?
All right. Okay. Thanks, Ev. I have a question about Robert Moses and that 1944 plan or the work that was done. Is there a connection with the highway planners of the 50s and 60s to what Moses did? I know he had this idea they cut right across east-west, but I was curious if there's anything else you could tell us about Moses and the work that was done in that era.
Well, some of the highway corridors that were in his plan were continued. Were just kind of grandfathered in as new plans were developed, and that includes the Franklin-Mulberry section, now known as the Highway to Nowhere. So the lineage of those plans goes back to Moses. But there was a lot of sort of Robert Moses-like thinking that went into plans well into the 1960s, where it was kind of accepted that highways and urban renewal were used to wipe out what they were called slums. lower income African American communities. And I don't know, I mean, this in some ways relates to the last question. I think that government supported gentrification, wiping out neighborhoods to promote and then redeveloping them for a completely different class of people. That is wrong. That's the kind of thing that was happening back in the 50s and 60s. But that kind of gentrification did not happen. But private individuals coming in and taking a chance on neighborhoods that other folks have regarded as iffy and investing in those properties, that's the kind of gentrification that I'm mostly in favor of, as long as it's sensitively handled.
All right. Well, with that, I want to give my thanks again to our speaker this evening, Evans Paull. And of course, it's been talked about often, and I'm sure many of you do, but go grab your copy, spread the word, continue to research on these topics, and I'm sure there'll be more to discover and plan for the future. But thank you so much for your time, everyone, and thank you to our speaker.
Don't go yet, though. A point of personal privilege, though. Speaking of gratitude, I'd like to express my gratitude to David Armente and Savannah Wood for this wonderful 2023 Baltimore History Evening series they put together. They both have demanding other jobs, and they put together an excellent series, and I'm very grateful for their work. Now you can go,
Mike.
Yeah, can I follow that really quickly? Mike did an excellent job for years and years and years in person and online. And you guys really stood on the shoulders and followed it up with just an amazing series this year. Kudos to you and Savannah for all of the things that you did to pull this together. And we're very appreciative.
Hip hip hooray. And good night.
Yep, appreciate you all, and certainly continue to follow us through our website for various activities and connecting around resources. But keep an eye out for more programming and other related activities in the fall as well. And also check out the Facebook group Baltimore City History, Baltimore City Historical Society to see what's going on. But thanks everyone. Good night.
Hey,
Thank you, David.
Can you stay after for 2 seconds?
Thank you.
You talking to me, Stephen?
Yep. Yes. Can you hang out for 2 seconds?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. David, this was incredible, dude. This was really incredible. And I'm thinking so 2 things. I want to help get this stuff out and get it so that other people can use it. Like the other board that I'm working on, Blue Water